World Trade Organization WTO. Hello friends, in this session we will discuss about World Trade Organization, popularly known as WTO. Further, we will discuss about how WTO came into existence, its functions, objectives and its working. Friends, let me introduce you to the topic. There was a time when the world was experiencing the problems of an extensive pattern of trade barriers in 1930s. So, Allied powers proposed a liberal world trading system in Havana 1947-48 for establishing International Trade Organization, also known as ITO. In Geneva Trade Conference 1947, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, known as GATT, emerged from the ashes of the Havana Charter and came into force from January 1, 1948. In January 1995, GATT disappeared and passed into history as it was merged in the World Trade Organization WTO. The GATT completed 8 rounds of multilateral trade negotiations known as MTNS. The Eurogirl Round, the 8th round, concluded with the signing of the final act on April 15, 1994 in Marrakesh and produced the WTO agreement and its annexes. The World Trade Organization WTO is an intergovernmental organization which regulates international trade. It has 164 members and 20 observer governments. The WTO oversees about 60 different agreements which have the status of international legal texts. Member countries must sign and ratify all WTO agreements on accessions. The WTO agreements are lengthy and complex because they are legal texts covering a wide range of activities. They deal with agriculture, textiles and clothing, banking, telecommunications, government purchases, industrial standards and product safety, food sanitation regulations, intellectual property and much more. Now friends, let us have a look at the 8th round or what we know as GATT and trade liberalization. The GATT was a multilateral treaty which had been signed by governments of member nations known as contracting parties. Its main function was to call international conferences to decide on trade liberalization on a multilateral basis. From 1948 to 1994, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, also known as GATT, provided the rules for much of world trade, for about 80% of world trade, and presided over periods that saw some of the highest growth rates in international commerce. It seemed well established, but throughout those 47 years, it was a provisional agreement and organization. The original intention was to create a third institution to handle the trade side of international economic cooperation, joining the two Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, also known as IMF. During this period, GATT sponsored 8 trade rounds, where member nations agreed to mutually reduce trade barriers. Now friends, let us have a look at GATT rounds or conferences of global trade negotiations. The first conference took place at Geneva, Switzerland in 1947. The second conference at Annecy, France in 1949. The third conference took place at Torquay, England in 1950-1951. The fourth conference at Geneva, Switzerland in 1955-56. The fifth conference was held again at Geneva, Switzerland in 1960-61, also known as the Dillon Round. The sixth conference was held at Geneva, Switzerland in 1964-67, also popularly known as the Kennedy Round. The seventh conference took place at Tokyo, Japan in 1973-79. The 8th conference in Punta del Este in Uruguay in 1986 1994. In the first rounds, negotiations were conducted on a product-by-product basis, also known as the request or the offer approach, whereby GATT contracting parties exchanged list of requests and offers on products of interest to them in order to reach agreement on tariff concessions. The WTO agreement is in fact the Eurogirl Round agreement, whereby the original GATT is now a part of the WTO agreement, which came into force from January 1, 1995. The objective of the GATT was to eliminate or substantially reduce trade tariffs and other impediments to trade on the basis of reciprocity and mutual advantage. Implicit in this principle are concepts which include: number 1, most favored nation (MFN) treatment, which prohibits discriminatory trade practices favoring one member state over another. Point number 2, principles of non-discrimination. National treatment which prohibits a member from employing domestic fiscal or administrative laws, for example taxes, to discriminate against another member country. Point number 3, remedies, for example anti-dumping and countervailing duties, which may be imposed unilaterally when members are found to be in violation of a GATT obligation. Now, let us look at the transition of GATT to WTO. By the late 1980s, a growing number of nations decided that GATT could better serve global trade expansion if it became a formal international organization. The 1982 Ministerial Declaration identified problems including structural deficiencies, spillover impacts of certain countries' policies on world trade that GATT could not manage. Therefore, they pressed for negotiations to formalize GATT and to make it a more powerful and comprehensive organization. To address these issues, the 8th GATT round, known as the Eurogirl Round, was launched in September 1986 in Punta del Este, Uruguay. It was the biggest negotiating mandate on trade ever agreed. The talks were going to extend the trading system into several new areas, notably trade in services and intellectual property, and to reform trade in the sensitive sectors of agriculture and textile. All the original GATT articles were up for review. In November 1992, the United States and European Union settled on reforms for agricultural trade in a deal known informally as the Blair House Accord. Finally, in April 1994, the deal was signed by most of the ministers from 123 participating governments at a meeting in Marrakesh, Morocco. Friends, now let us look at major criticisms of General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Point number 1, agriculture was treated as a special case where GATT rules hardly applied. Point number 2, developed countries had removed majority of tariff barriers but had devised new trade restrictions which are outside GATT rules, such as A. Voluntary export restraints, B. Low-cost suppliers, C. Market disruptions. The third criticism of GATT is GATT rules on subsidies were not explicit. These and other factors convinced GATT members that a new effort to reinforce and extend the multilateral system should be attempted. That effort resulted in the Eurogirl Round, the Marrakesh Declaration, and the creation of the WTO. Now friends, let us try to understand what exactly is WTO. World Trade Organization, known as WTO, is the only global international organization dealing with the rules of trade between nations. At its heart are the WTO agreements negotiated and signed by the bulk of the world's trading nations and ratified in their parliaments. The goal is to help producers of goods and services, exporters and importers conduct their business. But the WTO is not just about opening markets, and in some circumstances, its rules support maintaining trade barriers. For example, to protect consumers or prevent the spread of disease. Now let us have a look at the objectives of the WTO. The WTO has the following key objectives. Number one objective is to set and enforce rules for international trade. Also implement the new world trade system as visualized in the agreement. Objective number 2, to improve the level of living for the global population and speed up economic development of the member nations. Objective number 3, to resolve trade disputes and promote world trade in a manner that benefits every country. Objective number 4 is to increase the transparency of decision-making processes and enhance competitiveness among all trading partners so as to benefit consumers and help in global integration. Objective number 5 is to cooperate with major international economic institutions involved in global economic management and demolish all hurdles to an open world trading system and usher in international economic resistance, because the world trade is an effective instrument to foster economic growth. Objective number 6 is to ensure that developing countries secure a better balance in the sharing of the advantages resulting from the expansion of international trade corresponding to their developmental needs. Objective number 7 is to increase the level of production and productivity with a view to ensuring rising level of employment in the world and to make best utilization of world resources. Friends, now let us look at functions of WTO. WTO is designed to play an important role in the spheres of trade in goods, trade in services, foreign investment, intellectual property rights, etc. Friends, now let us have a look at the functions of WTO. Function number 1 is the WTO shall facilitate the implementation, administration and operations and further the objectives of this agreement and of the multilateral trade agreements, and shall also provide the framework for the implementation, administration and operation of the trade agreements. The second function of WTO is the WTO shall provide the forum for negotiations among its members concerning their multilateral trade relations in matters dealt with under the agreement in the annexes to this agreement. Point number 3 is the WTO shall administer the understanding on rules and procedures governing the settlement of disputes. Function number 4 is the WTO shall administer trade policy review mechanism. Function number 5 is with a view to achieving greater coherence in global economic policy making, the WTO shall cooperate as appropriate with the International Monetary Fund, popularly known as IMF, and with the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, popularly known as IBRD, and its affiliated agencies. Friends, let us have a look at some basic principles and areas of operation of WTO. There are a number of simple and fundamental principles of WTO. These principles are the foundation of the multilateral trading system. First is non-discrimination principle. Non-discrimination is a fundamental principle of the multilateral trading system and is recognized in the preamble of the WTO agreement as a key instrument to achieve the objectives of the WTO. In the preamble, WTO members express their desire to eliminate discriminatory treatment in international trade relations. Non-discrimination in the WTO is embodied by the two principles, number 1 being the most favored nation, MFN, treatment obligation, and number 2, the national treatment obligations. Let us look at point number A, the most favored nation, MFN principle. Pursuant to the WTO agreements, countries cannot normally discriminate between their trading partners. If a member grants to a country a special favor, such as a lower customs duty on one of its products, it must grant the favor immediately and unconditionally to all WTO members. Point number B, national treatment. The national treatment principle addresses the treatment to be applied to imported products once they are in a member's territory. The national treatment principle prohibits a member from favoring its domestic products over the imported products of other member countries. Now let us look at second point, reciprocity. It reflects both a desire to limit the scope of free riding that may arise because of the MFN rule and a desire to obtain better access to foreign markets. A related point is that for a nation to negotiate, it is necessary that the gain from doing so be greater than the gain available from unilateral liberalization. Reciprocal concessions intended to ensure that such gains will materialize. Point number 3, bidding and enforceable commitments. The tariff commitments made by WTO members in a multilateral trade negotiation and on occasion are enumerated in a schedule or list of concessions. These schedules established ceiling binding. A country can change its binding, but only after negotiating with its trading partners, which could mean compensating them for loss of trade. If satisfaction is not obtained, the complaining country may invoke the WTO dispute settlement procedures. Point number 4, transparency. The WTO members are required to publish their trade regulations to maintain institutions' permit for the review of the administrative decisions affecting trade, to respond to requests for information by other members, and to notify changes in trade policies to the WTO. These internal transparency requirements are supplemented and facilitated by periodic country-specific reports, trade policy reviews, through the Trade Policy Review Mechanism, also known as TPRM. The WTO system tries also to improve predictability and stability, discouraging the use of quotas and other measures used to set limits on quantities of import. Point number 5, safety valves. In specific circumstances, governments are able to restrict trade. The WTO's agreements permit members to take measures to protect not only the environment but also public health, animal health and plant health. Point number 6, prohibition of quantitative restrictions. As a general rule, quantitative restrictions are prohibited under the GATT 1994 agreement. However, in some cases, such as safeguard action, quantitative restrictions can be introduced under strictly defined criteria. Friends, now let us have a look at the structure of WTO. The Ministerial Conference is at the top of the structural organization of the WTO. It is the supreme governing body which takes ultimate decisions on all matters. It is constituted by representatives of, usually ministers of trade, all the members' countries. The General Council is the second level body in the WTO. It acts on behalf of the Ministerial Conference on all WTO affairs. It meets as the dispute settlement body and the trade policy review body to oversee procedures for settling disputes between members and to analyze members' trade policies. The General Council has the following subsidiary bodies which oversee committees in different areas. First is Council for Trade in Goods. There are 11 committees under the jurisdiction of the Goods Council, each with a specific task. All members of the WTO participate in the committees. The Textiles Monitoring Body is separate from the other committees, but still under the jurisdiction of Goods Council. The body has its own chairman and only 10 members. The body also has several groups relating to textiles. Number 2. Council for Trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. Information on intellectual property in the WTO, news and official records of the activities of the TRIPS Council, and details of the WTO's work with other international organizations in the field. Number 3. Council for Trade in Services. The Council for Trade in Services operates under the guidance of the General Council and is responsible for overseeing the functions of the General Agreement on Trade in Services GATS. It is open to all WTO members and can create subsidiary bodies as required. Number 4. Trade Negotiations Committee. The Trade Negotiations Committee, also known as TNC, is the committee that deals with the current trade talks round. The chair is WTO's Director General. As of June 2012, the committee was tasked with the Doha Development Round. The Service Council has 3 subsidiary bodies: Financial Services, Domestic Regulation, GATT's rules and Specific Commitment. The Council has several different committees, working groups and working parties. There are committees on the following: Trade and Environment, Trade and Development, Subcommittee on Less Developed Countries, Regional Trade Agreements, Balance of Payments, Restrictions and Budget, Finance and Administration. There are working parties on the following as well: Accession. There are working groups on the following as well: Trade, Debt and Finance, and Trade and Technology Transfer. Now let us look at the working of WTO. The WTO describes itself as a rules-based, member-driven organization. All decisions are made by the member governments and the rules are the outcome of negotiations among members. The highest decision-making body of the WTO is the Ministerial Conference, which usually meets every 2 years. It brings together all members of the WTO. Next body of authority is the General Council in the WTO. The WTO agreement foresees votes where consensus cannot be reached, but the practice of consensus dominates the process of decision making. The administration of the WTO is conducted by the Secretariat, which is headed by the Director General appointed by the Ministerial Conference for the tenure of 4 years. He is assisted by the 4 deputy directors from different member countries. The annual budget estimates and financial statement of the WTO are presented by the Director General to the Committee on Budget, Finance and Administration, popularly known as CBFA, for review and recommendations for the final approval by the General Council. Friends, now let us conclude today's session. The WTO's creation on 1st January 1995 marked the biggest reform of international trade since after the Second World War. It also brought into reality the failed attempt in 1948 of GATT to create an international trade organization known as ITO. Formation of WTO is widely regarded as the most profound institutional reform of the world trading system since the GATT's establishment. The Ministerial Conference is the supreme governing body of the WTO. It takes ultimate decisions on all matters. The General Council is composed of the representatives of all the members. It is the real engine of the WTO, which acts on behalf of the Ministerial Conference. The WTO's overriding purpose is to help trade flow as freely as possible, so long as there are no undesirable side effects, because this is important for economic development and well-being. Thank you, friends.